Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation. My name is John. I am the tattooed historian. And once again, it's great to be joined by my pal, Dr. Peter Carmichael, director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. Good evening, Pete.
John, it's good to see you. Nina, John changes his introduction for me all the time. I haven't heard doctor for a number of shows.
I'll throw it in.
He calls me El Jefe every once in a while. I just sort of let him go.
I like the formality here. I think that's good.
Formality is important.
You like formality?
As you can see, we're very serious here
Yeah.
as well. Nina Silber is with us this evening, and it's great to have her on the show. Nina is an accomplished historian from Boston University. We were catching up about her graduate work, which was at Berkeley, where she studied under Leon Litwack, a historian of note, who did, I believe, some path-breaking work in the 1960s with the new social history school. It's work that I think has particular relevance today. I think it's accessible work. I think it is work that allows us to hear voices of the past that often people had ignored. Leon Litwack, folks, look it up. Nina, we do a lot of show and tell here, and I've moved my library all over the place, and I unfortunately don't have a Leon Litwack book at hand to show the audience. But Leon Litwack, look him up. It's absolutely worth your time. Let's say a little bit more about Nina, and then again, we will then talk about her book this evening. I want to say, first of all, Nina is president of the Society of Civil War Historians. And Nina, we have told the audience about the journal, which again, usually is right at my fingertips.
I know, it's usually right at my fingertips too.
Thanks for this. Here we go.
There you go.
The Journal of the Civil War Era. And I think the one thing that I know Nina would agree with me about is that we believe that this association is one that is very inclusive for people that are not just professionals in terms of academics, but also public historians and the general public. I think one of the things that the journal prides itself upon is that the vast majority of the articles, although they're engaging what we would call historiography, they still are well written, they're accessible, and it's well worth your time. And the other thing that I should note is that we have a conference every year, and this year we were to have it in Raleigh, North Carolina, and it would have been last week. Is that correct, Nina?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so, of course, was canceled, but it will, we hope, restart next summer. And we'll be in Raleigh again? Or
the hope is to kind of pretty much lift up what we had and put it down next year at around the same time, same place.
So the conference obviously is part of the Society of Civil War Historians. You can look this up. Again, this has a UNC connection as well. But Nina, wouldn't you recommend to go to, or where would you recommend to go to find out about the Society as well as the journal?
I think best would be to go to the website for the society, which I'm not sure I could recite from memory, but it wouldn't be hard to find, the website, which will tell you all about the organization, the different kinds of book prizes and essay prizes that we have, the basic mission, and would have a link to the journal as well. What's great, if I could just make a little plug here for a minute, what's fantastic about becoming a member of this is it's a pretty inexpensive membership compared to a lot of organizations. I think it's $60 a year, and you get with that membership a subscription to the Journal of the Civil War Era. So it's really pretty. And you also, let me just add further plug. Everybody who's a member gets a copy of the book that wins the Watson Brown Book Prize, which is the best Civil War book of the year. So everybody gets a free book. That's right. And they get a subscription to the journal, all for the low price of their membership.
You can't beat that with a stick, as they said. I have, in fact, the winner this year. I'll be right back. I think I have it right here. And here it is. A UNC book again. They had a nice little score.
I think I have a blurb on the back of that book, by the way, too.
Let's see. You absolutely do, Nina. Right there, definitive study of Civil War monuments. That's right there. And so Thomas Brown gets the Watson Brown Prize. I don't think there's any connection there in terms of the Brown family, right?
I know. It felt like it almost felt a little too too obvious or something.
That's right. I don't think there's certainly no relation.
No, there's no connection. There's no connection.
But yeah, a fantastic book, and again, a book that I believe has great relevance to what is going on today. Let me say something else. Nina would not remember this, and I don't think you'll remember it, because actually our first meeting was not face-to-face. Our first meeting was a conference call. This, of course, were the innocent days before Zoom. Look, she looks puzzled. I'll tell you what it was about. We were on a conference call with John Hennessy and some other National Park Service people, and I think Gary Gallagher. In fact, I know Gary Gallagher was there, and we were talking about the initiative in the Park Service called Holding the High Ground, which was truly transformative, a way of trying to contextualize Civil War sites and to also think about causes of the war. It would include slavery, as well as looking at Reconstruction. You were on the phone there. I was on the phone. And I use that again, if you don't mind, to sort of reflect upon your thoughts, the ways that academic historians and public historians have worked together, are working together, and maybe what they can do in the future here.
Yeah, well, it's great that you mentioned that. I think it was in 1998 that they first kind of unrolled this initiative, and we went to Gettysburg, in fact, because, and I think it actually started because Eric Foner wrote a letter which was published in the New York Times. And he said, I recently was on a visit to Gettysburg, and it seemed to me that there was hardly any mention of the Union Army there. And there was hardly any mention that the war was fought over slavery. And, why doesn't the Park Service do more about that? And then the superintendent, John Latzer at the time, then extended an invitation, and he said, well, come to Gettysburg. Let's talk about that problem. And it kind of started then this whole initiative. So there was a group that was me. It was Eric Foner, Jim McPherson, and the three of us were, this kind of little troop that went to Gettysburg and, did a whole tour and talked and kind of really from the standpoint you're saying, what does the academic historian have to bring? What we toured the battlefield and kind of really thought about ways that the interpretation could be more inclusive. The interpretation, could sort of be mindful of like what kinds of visitors they might want to bring in, and also tell a history that was a fuller history about the African-American experience, even about women's experience. And I think that then kind of started a whole bunch of those initiatives between the National Park Service
and the OAH as well. Yes, I was shortly after your visit. They brought me to Gettysburg. I was an assistant professor at Western Carolina, and I was here for a month, I believe, maybe a month and a half during the summer, and had wonderful conversations and found, again, established relationships, professional relationships, in which there's true collaboration with Park Service historians here, and it's
it was great for us to kind of see what the Park Service was doing and really kind of get in there and kind of understand from their perspective how they were trying to tell the history.
Well, and and again, we all have different takes on this, and so feel free to disagree with me, but I really believe that what was initiated with your team of academics and others followed. And again, I want to stress that it was conversations. This is when academics coming in and saying, you've done this wrong, and you need to do this. We did just the opposite. And the results, I think, have been profound. And Kevin Levan, who is in fact, Nina's reading or writing group.
Yeah, that's right. We have
Boston. Yeah, I'm very envious of that. It sounds like a great group of people that you have together there. Kevin was on our show on Monday, and I gave him a little pushback on this, so it's nothing that I haven't said before. But I know that we always want to see greater diversity at our sites, and we certainly aren't where we would like to be. However, what we witnessed today, at least at Gettysburg, is a significant change from what happened a decade ago. And again, it is too simplistic to simply say, well, now people can see themselves in these exhibits or in this story, because there are plenty of visitor studies that prove that that's not the compelling reason as to why people go.
Sure.
People go to historic sites because they have a tradition of doing that begins in their youth. And so, and I'll quickly get this question back to you, that I wish I had said more specifically with Kevin, and I'll say now, is that Gettysburg National Park they have a program called the Great Task Before Us, I believe, or it's just called the Great Task. And what they've done, they received funding to bring underserved students, as well as I think some teachers, but certainly students from Baltimore and Philadelphia. Because as Chris Gwynn, the chief of interpretation at Gettysburg, the greatest impediment that the park believes in coming to Gettysburg is cost. Because Nina, when you were there, it was free. John, do you have a rough idea of how much it costs per person now at Gettysburg to go into the visitor center to do the cyclorama? I think it's pushing $15.
Yeah, it is. I know that's for sure. Yeah, at least 15.
So you put a hotel room in there and you put food in there.
Well, right, because it's not the most accessible spot for a lot of people.
It's not now. And that's not the criticism of the foundation. And it's important that our viewers understand there's a distinction there, that the Gettysburg Foundation, which is not the national park, they oversee the visitor center now. They staff the visitor center and they are the ones that set the prices. Now, listen, they've got bills to pay too, and they've got projects that they have to fund. And so this is a pretty tough nut here to crack. But I will say again, as I said with Kevin, I have found they've just had a change in the leadership of the foundation. And I'm hoping with that, there will be a more openness to give underserved people, including here in Adams County. I tried to get the Latino community, and I managed with my colleague in the Center for Public Service. We were able to get 2 buses. Barb Sanders of the park, who does her education, she is just a genius at it. She met me. We took the kids all around the battlefield, right? We had interpreters there as well. And we couldn't get into the visitor center for free. So we couldn't go. No one could afford it. We're hoping with the new regime that they'll see things a little bit differently. We need to get poor people.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely have to do that. Right. And so, and I'm sorry I got a little bit on a tangent there, which I
no, that's fine.
Need to do it all. But Nina, again, your connection, you're just one more example of that important bond between academics and public historians. And I think, John and I, we have been stressing that almost in every show. Very quickly, Nina is responsible for either edited or written a number of books. And as our viewers know, UNC will give you a nice discount, a steep discount. Here's The Romance of Reunion. And I didn't do my homework well, Nina. Is this your dissertation? Is it not?
Yes.
Yeah, an absolute fantastic, imaginative, creative work using cultural history in the very best sense of the word. A fantastic book, and one that I've always assigned to my students.
Thank you.
That I hope that you'll talk, and I'm only going to do 2 now. All right. Gender and the Sexual Conflict. This is based on Nina's Brose Lectures. The Brose Lectures are given every year at Penn State. And these lectures, they are the perfect jumping off point for anyone who wants to try to understand the experience of women in the war, Northern and Southern. Fantastic book.
Thank you.
It's a great starting point. And let me just, as a side note, when you assign a book like this, but you actually assign this is Nina's book, Daughters of Union. I had a graduate level class. I came in with this, and they're all holding this, which is substantially larger. So you can imagine how my students received me that day. Again, this is Nina's book, Daughters of Union. This is on Northern women. And again, it's fantastic. Published by Harvard. By Harvard, Daughters of Union. So again, look up Nina Silber. You'll see a long list. Nina, before we get to this book, your most recent. This War Ain't Over. Could you give our audience some ideas about how they might think about gender when they're at a Civil War site, battlefield? We hear all the time, man, they're just men that fought here. Don't bring gender in here because there's no one to talk about. So what would you say to that?
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that. I mean, one answer I'd give is men have gender too.
Absolutely.
So, and there's a whole bunch of scholarship now that really makes us think about what ideals about masculinity meant for soldiers, or just sort of how different standards about manhood that Northern soldiers might have had versus Southern soldiers. just how it was kind of part of a whole constellation of ideas, I think, that they had, that they brought with them to the battlefield. And then what, the experience of the battlefield meant in terms of masculinity. So that would be one part of the answer.
Nina, I think that's the one thing that I've noticed with some public historians, that they think of gender and they think of it, oh, you just mean we need to talk about women. So I'm glad that you made the first point that it's more than just women, right? And well, I think that, again, even on the battlefield, that if you want to talk about how soldiers made sense of the moment, here, July 1st through 3rd, that it's inseparable from the connection to the household.
Absolutely.
Not just in practical ways, but in emotional ways as well. And so every time on the battlefield, I make a point to contextualize a letter and remind the audience they're writing to a woman. and that communication back and forth is vital, right, to understand that specific moment on July the 1st.
Right. No, and I think that informs so much of what those soldiers do. The experience that those women are having at home is also then kind of informing what those, they're conveying fears or concerns, or, that's the interaction, I think, is so critical.
It's absolutely critical. Yeah. I was just, John and I are doing a tour on Saturday with 2 other people on Facebook Live, and we're going to be doing Pickett's Charge. And I'll be reading the letter of a Confederate officer who, after the battle, received a letter from his wife, a letter that described the destruction of their plantation. And in response to that, he saw some Union prisoners captured at Gettysburg, and he had 10 of them lined up, and he intended to have them shot on the spot. He was talked out of it. And I won't give away the entire punchline. It's really quite fascinating. I'm not sure he actually did that. I think that he was, to some degree, embarrassed, maybe even humiliated, certainly more than frustrated that he could not actually physically defend his home and his wife. And I think that he still wanted to sort of prove his masculinity by saying, look, honey, I tried to retaliate for you, and it didn't work out. So that dynamic is so important.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Go ahead, Nina.
No. I'm just agreeing.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and get us out of the gate, and then John, I'll turn it over to John. And again, here's a book, This War Ain't Over. And I'm going to just start with something that I read in the introduction that really just absolutely fascinated by. And it's about your father. It's really a lovely story. Silber, and he wrote a book, published a book, Songs of the Civil War. Yep. And he said, he wasn't like a diehard Civil War buff, and he wasn't like, in the evenings smoking his pipe and looking at maps and like, they should have done this. He wasn't that kind of a Civil War buff at all.
No, but he did like to sing those songs.
He did like to sing the songs. But this is something that you wrote, and I thought we could open with this, and then I have a question about your father I'd like to make sure that we end with. Okay, so here we go. This is what you wrote. This book is not about my father's Civil War, although it is partly about the people who created the kind of Civil War that my father came to love, as well as those who created the kind of Civil War that he despised. So tell us, what did you mean by that, and how can that help us sort of frame your book? And then we'll turn it over to John here.
So I think in terms of the kind of Civil War that he came to love, it was, I guess I would say that was maybe the Civil War. I'm going to say it was the Civil War created by the Popular Front. And by that, I mean this kind of, loose coalition of civil rights organizations, left-wingers, some people even in Roosevelt's administration and the New Deal administration. Also the kind of people who were really rooted, say, in the WPA, the Works Progress administration, the people who were kind of collecting oral histories, folk stories. This would have been like John Lomax doing this kind of work. And the people who were also collecting like those oral histories of slaves, former slaves who are still living in the 1930s. And so that's what I mean. What my father sort of saw was how the Civil War was not just that. I mean, he was a kind of, bottom up historian in some ways. It wasn't just the Civil War of, political leaders, military leaders, but it was a moment that ordinary people, black, white, expressed themselves, were, obviously involved as soldiers or as slaves escaping. So, I think he saw that as this really dynamic moment of change, or the possibility of change, that there was the emancipation, maybe even more than emancipation. So he kind of embraced that part of the Civil War. But then the part he despised, I would say, was the kind that was, repeating those very old traditional stories, basically what we call that lost cause story about slaveholders, sort of the tragedy that befell slaveholders when their way of life was taken away from them. The kind of story that basically manipulated the history of slavery, didn't really talk about its horrors. And it would have been epitomized certainly in the 1930s by something like Gone with the Wind.
Right.
That was kind of the ultimate expression of that. If ever there was a movie that my father despised,
that was it.
That was it. That was it.
And again, it's a superb section that you have on Gone with the Wind. And I'm embarrassed to say I've never read the book. Have you read Margaret Mitchell's book?
Yeah.
I've never read it. I've never read it.
Well, yeah, it's funny. When I teach a Civil War class, I'll often ask my students. Over the years, I've been asking them, "Who's read Gone with the Wind?" And I used to get I'd say almost all the women in the class would say that they had read it. Basically, none of the men had read it.
Right.
Now, not so much. Now, maybe there'd be 2 or 3 who say they've seen the movie.
Seen the movie, yes, right.
Yeah.
Right. Good. Excellent. Okay. Well, we'll come back to your father at the very end here, and we'll come back to your father at the end here. So go ahead, John. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I'm going to be transitioning into my doctoral studies at Western University in Ontario, and when I do so, I'm going to be studying the First World War. And in the 1920s, we see a questioning of the First World War. Was it worth it? Was the cost worth it, et cetera? Do we see this in the same frame with the American Civil War at the same time, since there's a questioning of war in general? Do we see this at the time with the Civil War, or is something manipulated to make it more appealing in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that kind of disillusionment about war that you're talking about, that you see especially in the 1920s, that's carrying over into a good portion of the 1930s. And there is a lot of apprehension about war in general. There's a lot of, the kind of ambiguity and skepticism that people felt about World War I is placed, I think, back onto the Civil War too. And you see it, for example, there's a lot of, the historians who write about the Civil War during the 1930s, scholars who write about it. We used to call it, Pete, when we were in graduate school, there was that whole blundering generation, the blundering generation interpretation, which kind of comes out of this moment and is very much influenced, I think, by that post-World War I mindset, which says, was it really worth it? The horrors of that war were atrocious. Why couldn't people have figured out a way to make peace, to come to an understanding, so they didn't have to have this horrific bloodshed? And I think that attitude really does shape a lot of thinking early on in the 1930s. You can even see it, one of the things that I found so interesting, I did some research into the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yeah.
So that would have been in 1938. And it was another one of those times when they, there was like a couple of thousand really ancient guys who were brought back to the battlefield. And it was interesting, actually. I think the federal government paid for them. It was kind of a New Deal thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, they did.
Yeah, so they paid for them to come back. But then there were, tens of thousands of other people who were there as well, not just the veterans. But, the newspaper coverage of the event has this kind of oddly, like they'll say things like, well, the horrors of World War I make the things that those veterans suffered in the Civil War look insignificant.
Wow.
Which you kind of think that's kind of a rude thing, like we're supposed to celebrate them and honor them, and it just felt like such an odd tone to strike at that moment. But that was kind of their feeling was, we've just gone through this horrible war, and let's not forget that. Let's not get all caught up in celebrating these Civil War guys. Let's remember, just how horrible the First World War was. So it was interesting to see that. And I also think, the one, maybe there was another, but the one big monument that's put up in the 1930s is it I always get this wrong. Is it the Eternal Light Peace Memorial or the Eternal Peace Light Memorial or
Eternal Peace Light Memorial?
It's the Eternal Peace Light. Okay. So that's the one monument that's unveiled at that 1938 reunion. And it's, to me, that's very much a product of its time. And it's a product of that sentiment that says there should be no more, it's got like those symbols. I think it's got sort of two women who are entwined with symbols of peace. And it's not a monument to me that kind of celebrates soldiers' heroism. Yeah. It's a monument that's really about, thank God that's over and let's have peace.
Absolutely. And John, you can correct me, but the monument's made out of what, Georgia sandstone? And is it Maine granite or New Hampshire granite? So it has going from north.
Yeah.
Just one of those.
Each side, yeah, exactly. And this idea of intertwining for reconciliation purposes and peace and harmony and that it was interesting you brought up the 75th was because I was thinking of it from I for a while I was on this kick where I enjoyed researching the 50th reunion of Gettysburg, and then I was reading about the 75th for a while, and the role of African Americans in the 75th is totally different than the 50th, right? Because we're still involved with Jim Crow and things like that, and things are starting to change a little bit on that front. Is that how we can see that as far as African American history is concerned? They're getting more political clout at the 75th, or they're just getting more notoriety at the 75th?
Well, right. I mean, I think what's interesting is, at the 50th, the veterans who come back to Gettysburg actually fought at Gettysburg. At least I think that's right. You're correct. And at the 75th, if they had limited it to only men who had fought at Gettysburg, they'd have
two.
Right. 10, yeah.
The numbers would be really small. So one thing you have going on at the 50th is because there really were not African American soldiers at Gettysburg. I mean, yes, it's a Jim Crow period, and they probably would have found ways to exclude them, but they're also excluded by the fact that there were not Black soldiers at the Battle of Gettysburg. But in 1938, there are actually, because they're not limiting it just to who fought at Gettysburg, there are actually a number of African-American men, veterans, who come to the 75th reunion, and they're interviewed. There's a great collection of photographs actually at Gettysburg of men who came to the 75th reunion, and a number of African-Americans are present at that ceremony.
And just a little plug for my college, Gettysburg College housed most of the veterans, right? It's not in the dorms, but they had buildings that accommodated them. So for that reunion, it was centered on the campus.
Right.
So one of the things, Nina, that you do so well in this book is you're able to recover a wide range of voices, the differences amongst people and how they use the Civil War as a usable past, and that's in fact your words. And I was really struck by your sensitivity to these complexities. Nobody could come away from your book and say, there was a white way of remembering the Civil War during the 30s and 40s, and there was a black way of remembering it. That kind of reductionism is just, you can't find. And again, I want to stress, this is a really well-written book. These are books, I think they can be very challenging to write. They're deeply analytical, right? It's hard sometimes to sustain a story. You got the analysis, you have the good stories, and you make some very important points. And so I'd like for you to just tell us, and I'll give you just sort of, you can range wherever you want to go. So you're telling us that the Civil War was remade during the Depression, right? Go in any direction you want to go. Give us any examples that you want to give, but help us understand how it was remade and how it served various groups for various ends.
So, I guess one thing I'd say is, like, one thing that struck me about the 1930s was it opened up a range of perspectives and voices who had a chance to kind of tell their Civil War stories, which, I would say prior to the 1930s, I mean, it's not that those stories weren't out there or didn't sometimes get into some, some books or records, but in the 1930s, I think a range of perspectives got legitimacy and got a kind of standing and could challenge, because I think up until the 30s, like overwhelmingly the lost cause is a kind of predominant interpretation. And so, it's kind of striking that in the 30s, you have more African-American writers and artists who are able to kind of put out their vision of the Civil War. You have people, with a much more kind of unionist perspective about the Civil War who are able to put that position out there. And partly I think it's because, again, like the federal government, the WPA, the way unemployed writers, artists were employed, and often, you had a Black artist who made a mural, which depicted Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln together, and went up in a post office, and so a kind of vision, I think, was possible in the 1930s in an earlier period. So that would be one thing. I guess the other point that or the other avenue I would take on this too, was how different Abraham Lincoln looked in the 1930s compared to earlier periods when Lincoln was portrayed. And one way I think, so I would say, for example, in the early part of the 20th century, or late 19th, early 20th century, I mean, it's not like people didn't respect Lincoln. It's not as if he wasn't a kind of central figure, but he tended to be, celebrated as this reconciler, as the unifier, as the person who could heal the country and bring people back together again. And in the 1930s, I think he emerged as a much more powerful figure of humanitarianism, somebody who, was actually really using the power of the federal government to bring, emancipation, to bring, to address the welfare of the people. And I think that was partly, that was a kind of response to the way Franklin Roosevelt wanted to create a whole new idea of Lincoln. In a way, I think Roosevelt wanted to create his own Lincoln that would kind of affirm what Roosevelt himself was doing. What he wanted was yes, somebody who really kind of strengthened the hand of the federal government, but did so with the aim of helping the people.
Right.
And that's what Franklin Roosevelt would have said about himself. So that was like, well, that's what Lincoln did too. And you have like over and over again, sort of people repeating this theme that, Lincoln, he's not just this kind of, the two sides, let's get the two sides together again. He's a much more kind of forceful figure that uses the national government in those kinds of ways.
And just, can you quickly also just kind of speak to Lincoln's own background, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, and how did that resonate with people as well?
Well, I'm not sure that I don't think Roosevelt played up. Of course. He played up so much all the different, parts of Lincoln's, formation or his childhood. Although it is true that I think, it was interesting that so many of the the movies about Lincoln in the 1930s tended to focus on his upbringing before he got to the White House. So like some of the most popular Lincoln movies or books or whatever of the period are really not about Lincoln when he's president, but it's like, Lincoln's romance with Anne Rutledge, Lincoln as the postal clerk in New Salem, Lincoln, wrestling with, what's his name? I can't even remember what his name is. You know who I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was also a little bit of a strategy too, I think, because, the more you talk about Lincoln in that phase of his life, the less you actually do have to talk about Lincoln as, taking like leading an assault against Southerners. So it's a little bit easier to talk about the early Lincoln than it is to talk about the late Lincoln.
It's not as politically contentious.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
One of my former, she was a student with me in grad school, Michelle Donarski, just asked, do you think some of this is related to Lincoln growing up poor and the Depression of the 1930s?
Absolutely. And, because that's that is a really important theme, I think, that you see is the way there's this kind of, what resonates for a lot of people during the Depression are these stories of hardship, overcoming hardships, the kind of obstacles, say, somebody like Lincoln had. I think you see that especially in, I'm thinking of Carl Sandburg's biography. He has this massive the 2 volumes about, the young Lincoln, and then 4 volumes of Lincoln in the White House. But those are really popular, extremely popular books. And I think that those really play on that theme of, the kind of poor conditions that Lincoln grew up in, and then kind of what he's able to do with that and come into his own in the presidency. Yeah.
So how does you talked about the Popular Front? Could you, with Lincoln, and you can bring in some other aspects of the Civil War past, I want to try to get again the sense of the more radical leftist edge when it comes to Civil War history, because like I said before, your sensitivity to a range of perspectives, not reducing to white and black, I think is one of the great strengths of this book. What about the Popular Front and the leftists? How do they treat Lincoln and some of these other topics?
So yeah, I mean, again, that's a kind of interesting thing is how much you had actually explicitly, left-wing writers and artists who had a voice and a platform in the 1930s. Again, a lot of them because they, had jobs in the WPA, or they, wrote plays that were part of the federal theater program. And you definitely see Lincoln as a really prominent thing. You see John Brown, I should say, too, in some ways. John Brown is a particularly important figure for, Popular Front writers. I mean, they wouldn't, I could say their names, but I'm not sure anybody would know because they're kind of obscure.
Right.
But John Brown, because he kind of forges an alliance between whites and blacks, which again resonated. If you were a kind of, left-wing person in the 1930s, that would have been something that was sort of captured the political possibilities of that moment. Was, could we bring black and white people together to, express their common interests and their common goals, and to fight their common enemies, and I think John Brown was a perfect historical example for that kind of political program. So there was he was an extremely popular figure, I think, for writers and artists working in that period.
And then a quick follow-up before I turn it back to John. Is there any usage of the Civil War to offer a true class critique? I mean, American capitalism, global capitalism, is dysfunctional, to say the least, in the 1930s. It would seem to me that they've got now their platform from which they could level some pretty hard blows against capitalism. And how did they use the Civil War past to accomplish that end?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what they do? So like sort of the phrase that kind of comes up over and over and over again is the idea of economic slavery. So it's kind of like drawing on, the language of the Civil War, but applied to the 1930s is, whether you're Black, whether you're white, you are living with this moment of intense economic exploitation, that your wages are rock bottom, your working conditions are as bad as they could be. So I think they kind of draw on that idea, and that whole theme of slavery, I think, becomes a very pronounced one for, in that language of the Popular Front.
And the white folks are even identifying, in a sense, with the slave experience, right?
Well, right. And that's, that is a whole other interesting theme, that I found so, in some ways, it's still a little mystifying to me, but how often, well, like, for example, I mean, I could see, one manifestation of that comes when, Roosevelt, for example, Roosevelt is championing Abraham Lincoln because he wants to be a president in the model of Abraham Lincoln. But at the same time, for Roosevelt to kind of too adamantly embrace the idea of racial justice is politically problematic.
Right, that's right.
And it's problematic because, Roosevelt is a Democrat. He relies on a whole contingent of Southern white Democrats, in his party in order to pass New Deal legislation. And for Roosevelt to really kind of push the envelope on racial justice would alienate him from that large contingent of support. So you have things like, Roosevelt would say, for example, Abraham Lincoln was not just the emancipator of slaves, but those of heavy heart everywhere, which is like such a vague, like, I don't even know what that means. Oh, I got a heavy heart. Who doesn't have a heavy heart, right?
Right.
But I think what he's really trying to do is he doesn't want to press too heavily on the race issue. He wants to make Lincoln somebody, it's not just for Lincoln. He's not just for Black people. He's for white people too. And I think what you get out of that too is that idea that white people can be slaves just as much as Black people could be slaves.
It's like the saying, nothing to fear but fear itself.
That makes sense.
Like, nothing to fear but fear itself. Like, what in God's name does that mean? And it just again shows you that people are so desperate in the Depression. Yeah, we'll go with it. That sounds good.
Yeah.
It's good.
Think about it for a while. Like, wait, fear is word fear. Like, wait. Yeah. No time for reflection.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
It would look good on a shirt, but they didn't think that way back then.
Heavy heart everywhere. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I thought it was very fascinating how left centered Americans at that time, leftists, if we want to call them that, embraced Lincoln so hardcore, in that I was thinking of the men and women who went to the Spanish Civil War,
right.
and they're the Abraham Lincoln Battalion,
right?
And they're so engrossed with this model of Abraham Lincoln, what they thought he was, and they propped him up in that way, that they even named their battalion after Abraham Lincoln as a freedom fighter sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, and I do think that's that is kind of the Civil War that my father, that's his version of the Civil War. That's his version of kind of telling a story that recognizes Lincoln for being a civil rights champion. But it's also, I think, especially like for left wingers, like what they're also trying to do, I think, in the 1930s is say, we're not like some crazy foreigners, right? We're not trying to impose a foreign ideology like that comes from Russia or something like that. We believe in an indigenous American radicalism.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, maybe it goes too far to say Lincoln, radical, but in a way, and I think that's what they're trying to convey. So they're very, interested in kind of reclaiming American figures who are kind of advancing, democracy, basically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The Sherwood Peters, who's been on here a number of times, he actually brought up, we go back to war regret for a second, and he says that
because of
North's moral exhaustion, from through the total retreat of Woodrow Wilson, which Woodrow Wilson is a whole other live stream in himself. As a First World War guy, I have my apprehensions about Woodrow Wilson, but that's an interesting point too about this. Like you said earlier, this what he calls moral exhaustion portion of it, and then you go into the economic exhaustion, and then the questioning of war itself, the questioning of classism, questioning of all that coming together into this stew, and then this as you've pointed out, white people saying that they were also enslaved by Southern whites saying they were enslaved by a Northern system. On them in Reconstruction.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Everybody's using the word slave. Everybody was a slave. At some point, everybody's saying I was a slave too, somehow or other. But on the moral exhaustion thing is a really interesting point because, I think what he's referring to is like this idea that Wilson says, yes, we're off with these high ideals, and then what you get afterwards is, really, did that really come to fruition? And so a kind of retreat from that, which I think is a really interesting factor in, the way World War I continues to kind of cast a shadow on people in the 1930s. And what happens, this is a kind of pivot I make in this book. What happens with the kind of looming possibility of World War II is how do people get morally re-energized? Because World War I, again, has kind of drained them of the sense, like, what war, is there any war that could possibly, why should we get dragged into another war again? That's just so fruitless. And so I think this is a real challenge for the Roosevelt administration, say by 1939, by 1940, it's clear that this, war is looming, that the United States is going to be involved. But how do they convince the people who feel that moral exhaustion that they should commit? And again, Lincoln is crucial to that process because Lincoln is sort of the figure I think that they embrace. Roosevelt embraces him. A lot of people embrace Lincoln as sort of a person. Basically, if we didn't have to go to war, we shouldn't go to war. But sometimes there's a moral principle that's worth fighting for. And so, the idea that Lincoln would embrace because this is pretty much their picture of Lincoln, that Lincoln, embraces emancipation. Lincoln embraces the abolition of slavery, that those are kind of, overriding moral concerns. And it's all over the propaganda that leads up to World War II, are pictures of Lincoln, using this language that says we cannot live in a world that is half slave and half free. So they use Lincoln's words constantly. There's a great quote from Robert Penn Warren where he talks about, kind of looking back on the period of World War II. He says, we used to go to the movies, and at the end, what flashes across the screen was not a picture of Washington or Jefferson, but it was Lincoln, because Lincoln was a kind of, the moral energy, the moral force that could sway people to say, okay, maybe this is a war that we should commit ourselves to.
You mentioned the movies, and in your book, you refer to the code.
Oh, the motion picture code. Yeah.
Motion picture code. Could you tell what's the code? And if you want to go down Gone with the Wind, that's fine. But if you'd rather bring in a different movie that illustrates the code, that would be okay too.
Right. I mean, so the code is, I think it's 1934. I mean, the Hollywood Motion Picture Association says, we have to have something that's sort of a more formal standard that we use to apply to movies that has to do with, relations between men and women. What are we going to depict in terms of sexuality? But it was also, and I didn't realize this, a big part of the code also had to do with how race relations would be depicted. And that, part of the code said we don't want to show anything inflammatory in terms of white and black relations. We certainly don't want to show anything that suggests racial intimacy, miscegenation or whatever they would call it. So that was also another feature of the code, which, sometimes that had the effect, I think, of just kind of like taking Black people out of the movie altogether. so that wouldn't ever be a possibility. I mean, to me, it sort of comes up in an interesting way in Gone with the Wind, because Selznick, in producing Gone with the Wind, he knows that he can't and doesn't want to kind of reproduce Birth of a Nation. He doesn't want a movie where, you know, there's like clear racial hostility. And so instead, what he wants is a movie that is a little more lighthearted, you know, that has a kind of more friendly approach to Black-white relations. But I mean, of course, what you get from that is a stereotype and a misreading in its own way. You know, it's not the belligerence and angry hostility of Birth of a Nation, but it's instead that kind of, well, everybody loved each other on the plantation.
And docility. Every enslaved person's docile.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Everyone, right? Everyone is docile.
Exactly.
I mean, Mammy has a degree of influence and asserts herself from time to time, but when she does it, she still is playing that stereotype, that caricature, right, of the Mammy, right? As portrayed. I'm going to ask for about another movie. Your analysis of the Shirley Temple movie. It's fascinating. And I can't get the title in my head.
The Littlest Rebel.
What is it again?
The Littlest Rebel.
Littlest Rebel. That's right.
Which is often confused. People will confuse that one with The Little Colonel. They're very similar.
So tell us about the Littlest Rebel.
Yeah, so The Littlest Rebel is Shirley Temple, 1935. She is the daughter of a Confederate, and her father's off fighting. And then I think a Union contingent comes to her plantation. And so somehow or other, she befriends a Union soldier. It's a very convoluted plot, but somehow or other, well, and of course, you know, a big part of the movie too involves, you know, this kind of happy-go-lucky life that she lives on the plantation, where Bill Bojangles Robinson is the butler, or is, you know, kind of the head of the household. So of course, that's an opportunity for them to do some dance numbers together. So that's important. But somehow or other, by the end of the film, and I don't even really remember, there's an accusation that her father has been a spy, that the Union soldier who has befriended her was helping her father, the spy. So then they're both in prison. And so by the end of the movie, you know, Shirley Temple and Bill Robinson have to go and see Lincoln and plead with Lincoln, you know, will you free, you know, this sort of, there they are. So Shirley Temple and Abraham, she's sitting on Abraham Lincoln's lap. They eat an apple together. And you know, he's all folksy and whatever. And he says, well, okay. And so of course, the way the movie ends, it's not Lincoln freeing the slaves, but it is Lincoln freeing her father and the Union soldier from prison.
Yeah. This Lincoln is very lucky that his face didn't melt from the lights in the studio. I mean, you look at that picture, it's just, they got wax caked all over.
I know, it looks pretty awful.
Just a very quick question about this. Do you show a film like, you know, The Little Rebel, or do you show Gone with the Wind to your students? How do you deal with these kinds of what, you know, some people would be deeply offended to have to watch? What's your take on that?
Yeah. So I have had my students watch both of those movies, you know, because I teach a class regularly on the Civil War in memory. And usually what I do for that class is I'll say, you know, there's all kinds of movies. I'll kind of give them a list of choices and say, you know, pick any of these movies. And then we're kind of going to come in and share our stories about what we watched and what we learned from those movies. And I do find that quite a number watch the Shirley Temple movie. And, you know, they're kind of, yes, and it's true. I think in many cases, especially with Gone with the Wind, and absolutely, I'm not even sure I'm going to show Birth of a Nation anymore because that one is just so deeply offensive. But I do kind of tell them in advance that they're going to see things that are very different from what we see today in movies. And the thing, the Littlest Rebel is particularly shocking because there's a scene when Shirley Temple appears in blackface.
Yeah, that's right.
And so I think, that they come away thinking, wow, like, because that's not anything. I mean, they never, well, maybe they see, reports in the news now of somebody being in blackface, the governor of Virginia, for example, right? But to kind of see that in a movie, I think has, really leaves this kind of profound impression on them.
Right. Yeah.
Jeremy Becknell has an interesting question. What difference was there between the usage of American Civil War's propaganda for World War II in the South and North? I wouldn't expect you would have something of like Lincoln in Charleston, South Carolina, or something like that, would you? Or was it pretty universal?
Well, I mean, Lincoln was a kind of universal figure in a lot of wartime propaganda. There were some white Southerners who even, talked about kind of finding a way to appreciate Lincoln. But I think it is true that what you got more of, so for example, Douglas Freeman, who's well known as a biographer of Robert E. Lee, and during the 1930s wrote a kind of, famous 4-volume biography of Lee. He was enlisted pretty significantly to gin up kind of propaganda for World War II, and kind of using the example of Lee as a very, in terms of his military acumen, it was hard. The problem was, I think Freeman was put into work a lot to kind of make that case. It was just harder to make the case for Lee as a kind of moral figure, somebody who could kind of harness this moral energy. It was harder to make the case for Lee than it was to make the case for Lincoln. So almost by default, I think Lincoln kind of became he was used much more often. But you're right. But the question is spot on, because it kind of points to a tension, which I think, I'm sure the Roosevelt administration was aware of. It's interesting because this, in fact, just came up in the news. It is actually right around the time of World War II that a lot of military bases were named for Confederate generals. And so in some ways, I think that's another thing that's going on here is the, how do we kind of not potential recruits coming out of the South, bring them into the war effort. And I think that's one thing that happens to kind of, keep, or, just to kind of not alienate Southern whites.
Yeah. That's a good section in your book about about the basis, and you're right. It's trying to spur on enlistment as well. So I'm a student. I'm an undergraduate, and you've assigned your own book to me, to the entire class. I know. It's always, I think, a mistake.
And then you found it online somewhere, so you didn't have to buy it. So that's
and so they come to you after this, right? And again, they're an undergrad. And they say to you, I found this book to be depressing, because it seems to me that the search for the past is a search to simply use, or what people have demonstrated over time is to use that past for their own interests. Sometimes they're narrow interests, sometimes for sordid purposes. And so rather than seeing history and getting to the truth or getting deeper understanding, what this book tells me is interpretations are always changing, but they're changing in ways that aren't giving us greater enlightenment. And they're changing because, people are using this thing.
Yeah.
What would you say to your students?
Yeah, sometimes that's true. No question. Sometimes that's true. And that's, illuminating in and of itself, because it tells us something about our own political moment and how people are going to constantly use history. You kind of learn a political lesson that way about how people are always using history to further a particular cause. But I think there is another part of it too, which is, like when I say I looked at the 1930s and saw a whole new range of perspectives and voices that were being heard, you kind of think like we would never, as limited and problematic as they are, to have like the oral histories done with ex-slaves, like the kind of material that was unearthed, that was made possible. You know, it's hard to imagine us doing our work without having, without getting that kind of material now to understand and to work with and to pore over. So I think that, the 30s really do have, like, it makes our Civil War world so much richer to have that 1930s perspective on it.
And that challenge in some places, not all, particularly in the South, but at least there were people who were foreshadowing the challenge to lost cause dogma, right? We see some cracks, right? We see some cracks.
Right. People, just the idea that people would say, this is not the only interpretation of the war that's out there.
What if I ask you about today? And if I were to say to you, and I'm going to say to you, that from your book, I was inspired to see how people did draw from the past in meaningful ways. And even though maybe their history was a little imperfect, I still, it just made me feel good that history really mattered. And so now I'll make the argument that history doesn't really matter as it once did. And in fact, I'll even go a little bit further, and I'm going to argue that Civil War is about this close to being irrelevant, because what we've seen of late at Confederate monuments are historians, and I think in part, who say, oh, here's our chance to be able to talk about the connections to the past, and we've done so, and I think for the most part in a sophisticated way. But the destructions of those monuments, they are part of a democratic moment, an upsurge, an upheaval. I mean, and these are moments in which I don't see history as a guide. I don't see history necessarily as an inspiration. And I say that, again, as a sort of a question to throw out there and to think about. I could be wildly wrong, or maybe not. Right? I mean, I just don't see anything today, right, that I saw in your book. And I think the quick response for me is saying, well, Pete, it's today. We're in the maelstrom. How can you figure anything out? And I can see that. You see, I like to argue against myself. You can imagine I'm a real joy to live with. I just circle around and throw.
Right, and then your students are like, wait a minute, which is the answer on the
Because as I say to my students, I want you to leave my class confused.
Yeah.
I don't want you to think you have any good answers there. Be confused. So, yeah. So what do you think about my observation?
So, all right. Well, maybe I'm a little confused. So the question then is...
So the question is, has the Civil War starting to lose its relevance? Is, in light of what's happened over the last 2 weeks, do we see that some of these movements on the ground of Black and white folks and the issues that they're confronting, and they're, of course, taking it to these Confederate monuments, but is it disassociated from history? Are they connected to the past? Are they thinking of the past? And I'm not criticizing anyone for that. I'm just trying to understand. I mean, if you go to England, for example, does anyone get all revved up about the English Civil War and say, yes, feel strongly about Cromwell? Does anyone in France feel strongly about Napoleon now? I mean, in time, memories fade, meaning fades, the usability fades. Are we at that moment now?
Well, right, but isn't the very fact that one of the first places people are going to are those Civil War monuments? Like, isn't that an indication that people are mindful of their history?
Yep.
I mean, you know, like when you recognize that, okay, here's the statue of Jefferson. Didn't that just come down, Jefferson Davis? And
so Lee's coming down, and then I think
the marchers actually took Jefferson Davis down.
Davis went down last night. Yes.
Yeah. So the fact, so that on some level there is an awareness of history, because there's an awareness on the one hand that here was Jefferson Davis who, justified the system of slavery, went to war over the system of slavery. That's a kind of historical knowledge that people have. On some level too, there's a knowledge that statue, for a whole variety of historical reasons, wasn't telling the truth. That its very presence was a kind of whitewash of history. So it's not coming out in a clean and neat way that we might want it to, but it does feel somehow that people are reckoning with history.
Let me just say, I don't think it should come out in a clean way. I just throw out the questions.
No, I get it.
But I think you've made some really good observations about it. So I'd like to get in the last question here. Okay, ready? What do you think your father would think about this moment? What would your dad think?
God, he wouldn't like Donald Trump. I would say that. I guess that goes without saying.
Yeah, right.
I think he would say it's a moment when who knows what's going to happen. I mean, in a way, it's like there's definitely a history from the ground up that's taking place right now, and so that kind of popular front guy in him would say, yeah, who knows where this is going to go, but it's great to see, people expressing themselves. So I'm sure that would be something he would focus on.
Yeah. Absolutely. Nina, it's been so wonderful to have you. John, do we have any other questions from our audience this evening?
I really like.
There were some great questions. I love those questions we got already. They were great.
Yeah.
Our audience is always ready to rock and roll with questions, comments, and it's great. It's been a lot of good comments in here as well. So we'll have to get to those later. But I do want to get
to see them.
Pardon?
Will I get to see those comments?
Oh
too?
yeah. Oh
okay.
yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. They'll all be published on right underneath this video, so you can go back anytime and see those, and we can link you to those as well.
Right.
John,
yes.
We should go to your Facebook page to be able to find the comments.
Yes. Most of the comments, I believe all the comments this evening are on my Facebook page. I don't have any on my YouTube page, I don't believe, at the current time, but that may change later. All of them right now are on the Facebook page, facebook.com/The Tattooed Historian, but I can send the link out for you to be able to go over them whenever it's convenient for you. I know a lot of people would love to hear back. And I actually pinned a link to the Society of Civil War Historians at the top as well for people who wish to join. And I also have the link in the description to the side, whichever way it is, I don't know which way it is, of your book from UNC Press, along with the discount code, which we have the books there. And again, I have the discount code here for anyone who wishes to do so. And I know a lot of people have actually reached out and said they have enjoyed using that discount code because they love that UNC gave such a steep discount. So
yeah, that is great.
Nina, we're not going to make any money off our books.
Yeah.
40% off?
Well, I don't think we got into this work for that reason. So
we don't make any money. People are shocked. We're like, well, how much money did you make? I'm like, you don't want to know. And if I have to bring it up, I'll weep.
It bought me a nice dinner, maybe.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, Nina, it's great seeing you. And thank you so much for coming on the show. I so enjoyed the book. And like I said, I found your father. What a fascinating guy. And it's going to be your next project. So
yeah,
a few more years, man. I'll get to see that. That'd be
cool. Who knows how long, but yeah.
I would love to hear more about his time with Bob Dylan, talking to Bob Dylan, because
all right, I'll let you know if I actually score this interview with him. So
yeah, I was just listening to The Girl from the North Country today, and I'm like, oh, Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
So.
And so, John, we have 2 shows coming up. Nina, we usually just do Monday and Thursday, but this weekend, in fact, Nina was going to be at the conference this year. She was going to come and speak. And of course, obviously, we had to cancel, but we're going to do 3 shows on Saturday.
Yes.
As a sort of a recognition of the conference. So we start on Saturday morning with Scott Hartwig. What time do we begin?
We begin at 9 a.m. on Saturday, I believe.
Say hi to Scott for me.
Yeah, he's a great guy. And we're going to talk about Antietam with Scott Hartwig, and then we'll get a little bit of a break, and then we have Jen Murray,
yes,
who is at Oklahoma State, and Jen Murray will be talking about George Gordon Meade.
Mm-hmm.
Then we'll get a few hours off before we do the tour with Chris Quinn of the National Park Service, Jim Broomall at Shepherd University, and of course John and myself. So that'll all be on Saturday.
Great.
I'm looking forward to seeing everyone. So Nina, again, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Pete, as always. And thank you, everyone, for watching, for commenting, sending in your questions. You all are fantastic with that each and every time we go live. So thank you so much. And this will be published on my Facebook and YouTube page. I'm sure it's going to be shared out on the CWI Facebook page as well. And later on, it will be on the CWI's YouTube channel for you all to peruse and enjoy at your own convenience. So thank you all so much. Hope you'll tune in Saturday when we wear ourselves out doing so many live streams, which is going to be fantastic. But we're going to have a great time. We hope you tune in and enjoy those as well. So have a great night, everybody. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves.